October 16th, and my name is Bill McCamley. I'm a state representative from Las Cruces and Mesilla here in New Mexico, and this is your legislative update for the day. I'm sorry it's Sunday. I did a couple of interim committees on Thursday and Friday, and I forgot to get this video done for those days, so I'm trying to make up for it now. The committee I was at in Santa Fe was the Interim Revenue and Stabilization Committee. That's the group in charge of doing a lot of some of the fiscal stuff for the state, specifically a lot of the issues regarding taxes and capital outlay. And those are two things I want to talk about with you now. So there was a presentation by a combination of staffers from the legislative side as well as the governor's administrative side regarding capital outlay. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about money that is used on infrastructure. And legislators specifically get the ability to allocate certain amounts of money every year, depending on what we have available. We get this money from oil and gas sales. And we get allocated a certain chunk that we can then delegate to cities, counties, school boards, those types of groups to build critical infrastructure. Things like water and wastewater systems, senior centers, buildings for police units, that sort of thing. And there are some problems with this, though, and that was what the presentation was about. The first thing they said was we do way too many small projects. So it takes just as much money to administer a small $30,000 project as it does to administer a $3 million project. And if you do a bunch of these little projects, you increase the amount of administrative costs you need. Secondly, a lot of times not enough money is allocated per project to get it done. And this is for two reasons. Number one, we only get a certain amount. There's a lot of needs. So a lot of times a legislator, rather than getting one project done a year, will fund 4 or 5 projects per year, even though there's not enough, and try to do that over time. And that allows for a little bit more of a political happiness with people, because you can say, hey, I gave you money, because you don't want to just tell people no. But the problem with that is a lot of times it takes a while to get stuff done. The third problem is sometimes some of the smaller organizations that we tend to deal with, some of the smaller cities, school boards, water and wastewater districts, don't really have the administrative capacity to process these things in an expeditious manner. And so there's a couple of problems, right? Money sits in bank accounts and projects don't get finished. And this has been a huge issue in the state. So a couple of recommendations they give were for legislators to really come together and focus on a smaller amount of bigger projects to be able to get those done faster. And also they thought about putting together some kind of board at the state level that might even allocate this money instead of having it for legislators. A couple problems there. Number one, you tend to give a lot more power to the governor's office, which can be good and bad depending on how that works. But there's an issue of fairness throughout the whole state. One of the good things about having legislators appropriate this money is an equal chunk of money is given to an equal chunk of amount of the state. And if you don't have that, do you get sometimes where a certain region, and I'm from Las Cruces, we always worry that the Albuquerque Santa Fe area would get a bigger chunk of the pie. So we kind of talked about that, and it's an interesting problem that we have to deal with. And the second thing we talked about was the history of job creation in the state, and one of the problems that's led to, because we haven't done so well, is that we don't have enough money coming in to invest in the things we need to get more jobs. And so Dr. Jim Peach, who's actually from New Mexico State, came and gave a presentation, and it's rough. So between 2007 and 2016, only Wyoming had a fewer amount of jobs per capita created than New Mexico. We actually have 21,000 fewer jobs now than we did in December of 2007, which is right before the big crash happened with the Great Recession. We have an over-reliance on oil and gas revenues for our state, and that makes investment difficult because it's highly volatile. And when you have a situation where those prices are low, and I talk about this quite a bit in these videos, you can't really invest in things like education and infrastructure, which are the things that a lot of companies, both that want to start here and move here, are looking for. Actually, there was a good question asked of Dr. Peach, since he's been doing this since the early 80s. He said, what would you have done differently? And he said two things. Number one, I never would have had the tax cuts that were passed on wealthy folks' income and capital gains done in the early 2000s. Because at the time we had high oil and gas revenues, but now we don't. And that means we don't have the money to invest in these very critical workforce and infrastructure needs. The second thing he said he would do is restructure our gross receipts tax. So when you go buy a VCR, not a VCR, a DVD player, for instance, you pay a gross receipts tax on it. That is a very complicated situation here in New Mexico, because we also pay that on services, which is good and bad or whatever, but there's so many holes. There's like 387 of these things, and it creates a complex environment for businesses to do well. And he said I would have tried to restructure that a lot earlier. So these are the things that were brought up. I appreciate you all listening to this. As always, if you have questions, comments, or concerns on these or any other issues, love to hear from you. Thanks a lot. Hope everyone's having a great weekend. Bye.